Hi everybody, and welcome to another Composing Harmonies video. If you're new to the channel and enjoy these videos, be sure to check out my Patreon page. For all of these harmony videos, I upload a supplemental video that goes into more detail with more examples on the topic. The link for that is in the description box below this video. Okay, so let's say you've come up with a chord progression and you're happy enough with the chords that you want to try and turn it into a piece of music. Here's a chord progression that I just came up with. It's in B minor and it uses diatonic major and minor chords. These chord labels simply tell us which three notes make up each chord, but they don't tell us anything about where those notes appear registrally or in what configuration the chords are constructed. If I were to perform this progression on the piano for you, I would be making a lot of decisions on the spot about the arrangement of notes. A lot of my decisions would be intuitive and a result of my piano playing habits, as I tend to voice chords a particular way. If a guitarist played these chords, I'm sure they'd be voiced very differently. If you're relatively new to learning music or composition, you might play an instrument really well or you might not. And if you don't play or if you don't play very well, you might struggle to come up with effective voicings for chords. Fortunately, I do think it's something that can be learned with just a bit of practice. Let's start with the most basic voicing for each chord. Here are the root position triads and a closed voicing for each chord in this progression. To review the terminology here, root position means that the root of the chord is placed in the lowest voice. So for the first chord, the root is B, and so a root position B chord features a B as the lowest sounding note. With a three-note chord, there are obviously three possible lowest notes. These are referred to as inversions. While the notes that make up the chord are the same, each inversion sounds slightly differently to our ears, and throughout history, the different inversions have been used in different contexts. That's in part because our ears hear the lowest note as having some structural significance. There's a stability in having the root as the lowest pitch, and there are varying degrees of instability in having inverted voicings. Of course, how we hear inversions is also dependent on other factors, including register and spacing, but the ordering of notes is certainly important. The other term I mentioned was closed voicing. A chord has a closed voicing if all of the possible chord tones between the top and bottom notes are present. If chord tones are skipped, as is the case here, then it's an open voicing. In this example, I'm skipping over the low D just below the staff, as well as the B in the middle of the staff. Just like inverting chords, changing the type of voicing affects how we hear the chord. Often, chord voicings will include some notes in a closed voicing and some in open. This is fairly typical in piano voicings. You see the right hand in a closed voicing, and then the left is open. Lots of reasons to use different voicings in different circumstances. I'll talk more on that shortly. Returning to this progression, these are all root chords in closed position. All the notes are there, the harmonic progression itself is a decent one, and yet it's not a very musical realization of this progression. By exploring chord inversions, note spacing, and how notes move from one chord to the next, aka voice leading, we can get this to sound a lot more musical. Let's start by looking at just the first two chords. If I split up each note of the triad into its own part, aka voice, then you can easily see the voice leading between chords. In a piano texture like this, since there aren't individual voices or instruments playing each note, our ears will assume a voice leading that maintains note ordering. In other words, the lowest note in the first chord moves to the lowest note in the second chord, even though technically that pitch is present in the second chord. The middle note from chord 1 moves to the middle note of chord 2, and the top note from chord 1 moves to the top note of chord 2. So as you can see, the voice leading isn't exactly smooth between chord 1 and 2. Each note jumps a descending third. Smooth voice leading occurs when the majority of notes move by step or don't move at all. Just as a side note, there will be times when you don't necessarily want smooth voice leading. Certain emotions are best captured with large, unpredictable, or jagged leaps. I'll talk more about that in future videos. So if I change the inversion of one or both of these chords, I can achieve smoother voice leading. Here I'm moving the top note, the F sharp, down an octave. It's now the lowest note of the chord. This is a second inversion chord now. The voice leading is much smoother, with only the lowest note needing to move by step. I could instead move the G from chord 2 up the octave and create a similar smooth voice leading between chords. With this configuration, the first chord stays in root position, and the second chord is now in first inversion. To make this voicing more pianistic, I'll spread the notes over the left and right hands. Here are 4 different voicings, all with very smooth voice leading and a first inversion G major chord. There are so many possibilities, each one will sound a bit different. The one on the left is fairly compact registrally and voiced in the mid to low range. The next one has a slightly more open sound, voiced a bit higher in the right hand. There's also parallel motion in octaves from F sharp to the G. I tend not to worry about this sort of thing, especially in the inner voices. The next one places a much fuller, closed voicing right hand chord over top octaves in the left hand. This example clearly defines a bass part that is distinguished from the rest, simply because of its registral separation and emphasis at the octave. And the last one here shifts the voicing much lower in a relatively closed position, therefore much darker in timbre. Voice leading is obviously something you should always be aware of, but that doesn't mean that your voice leading should always be extremely smooth. Here's that progression once again, and I've tried to create very smooth voice leading throughout with as little movement between adjacent chord tones as possible. Here's what this sounds like. To my ears, it sounds boring and very stagnant. Too little motion between chords, and there tends to be a very boring shape to the music. But too much motion, and the music might sound disjointed and rough. So how do you find a good balance? This is a topic that might span many videos, but for now, there are a few things I like to consider. Even if you're writing just background chords, whether they're arranged for piano or strings or brass or winds, it doesn't matter. I always try to give the top line an interesting and musical contour. In the previous example, I demonstrated how boring a static line can sound. Even if this isn't the foreground melody or texture, the only time I'd want to have something like this is if I wanted to create a sense of stillness. Most of the time, I try to give the top line a more interesting shape with a combination of stepwise motion and some leaps. I pay attention to the overall trajectory. When does the line move up and when does it move back down? If I draw a curve over this line, you can really see the contour and shape. But if the line moves too much, it might sound jagged and unpredictable, which may or may not be what you want. So it's nice to vary the interval motion in the top line. I aim for mostly stepwise motion with an occasional leap. I then like to have the top line interact contrapuntally with the bottom voice. Oblique and contrary motion are preferred, and parallel motion between the top and bottom voice tends to sound like the whole texture is either rising or falling, which in some cases might be what you want, but you should be aware of it. If this is my top voice, then I might end up with a bass part that looks like this, with mostly contrary motion. It so happens that the bass here is playing all roots, so I'm not using any inversions. I try to have very smooth voice leading between inner voices, preferably moving by step at most. But this really depends on the context, including what instruments you're writing for. If I'm writing for piano, I might need the inner voices to move in a similar contour to the top line because I'm limited in what my fingers can play. But this type of inner voice motion works nicely with instrumental writing as well. For instrumental ensemble writing, I don't have to worry about what's playable on piano, so I can have smoother voice leading among inner voices. Notice that in each case, I try and maintain the same number of notes per chord. This isn't always necessary. Again, it depends on the context, but when I'm planning out my chord voicing, I always default to keeping the chords the same size. Another thing to consider, octaves in the bass reinforce the bass notes and therefore are heard as one voice, so I don't necessarily worry about parallel motion. The same is true to some extent with fifths in the bass. We hear the fifths moving together as a unit instead of independent voices. In terms of inversions, root chords are more stable and sound stronger than inversions. Inversion chords can be used for a variety of reasons, including creating a smoother bass line, or to either create or to suspend motion. Here, the repetition of the bass note B via inversions of the chord almost creates a sense of anticipation and instability. And lastly, I try to use first inversion chords, or even third inversion chords if working with four-note chords, over second inversion chords. Second inversion chords have a tendency to sound cadential, and I find myself rarely using them unless I'm trying to cadence. Speaking of third inversion chords, adding additional chord tones can be a really great way to make your chord voicings more interesting and have better voice leading. This sort of builds on the last video in this series, which introduced the idea of common tone chord progressions. I'll take the same set of chords from before in a simple four-part voicing. I'll look specifically for notes that are found in one chord but not in the very next chord. For instance, this F sharp, it's the only note from the B minor triad that isn't part of the G major triad. If I add the F sharp to the G major triad, now it's a G major 7 chord. With 4 notes and 4 voices, I also don't have to worry about which note to double. Now from the G major 7 chord, there are a few notes that I could carry over to the E minor chord. I notice that in the E minor chord, I'm doubling the root right here. So instead of doubling, I could have the D from the previous chord stay put. This results in another 7 chord, now an E minor 7 chord. And there's no reason I have to limit myself to just one extended note per chord. In addition to the 7th scale degree, I could also continue to have this F sharp holdover. The only potential problem is that I no longer have the 3rd of the chord. Dorico labels this as an E7 sus2 chord, which doesn't account for the context. That would imply a major 3rd is being suspended as a 2nd, but in reality it's the minor 3rd that's missing. To be honest, I think obsessing over chord labels does more harm than good. I don't really care what you call this, only how it sounds and its implications within the context. And by holding this through the first 3 chords, that creates yet another common tone. The F sharp helps to bridge all of these chords together. I'll add similar extended notes in the second half of the progression. I try to always look for opportunities to create subtle variations, so when I repeat the G major to E minor, perhaps I'll do something a bit different. I'll let the inner voices move up to complement the contour of the top line in the last 2 measures. There's an awkward interval here from the G to the A sharp, but that can always be improved with some passing tones. For instance, how about an A natural on the 8th note before? When you start adding extended notes like 7ths and 9ths, you might find it's necessary to have more voices present to get those richer harmonies. Here's another version I've made using the same top and bottom voices, but I've altered the inner voices by using 7ths, 9ths, and 11ths. And after the first measure, I move to having 6 total notes per chord. I really like some of the tension that the minor second intervals produce, especially in the F sharp chords. Dorico labeled this as an F sharp major add 11 chord, though I hear this more as an F sharp major chord with an added 4, similar to a sus4 chord. However, the 4 and the major 3 are simultaneously present. So here's what this progression sounds like. All right, so this has been just an introduction to voicing chords, and as I continue this series, I'll talk more about this, as well as voicing chords for different instruments. In my next orchestration video, I plan on taking this basic progression that I've shown today and placing it into different orchestral textures, so stay tuned for that one. And don't forget to check out the supplemental video for this one. It's on my Patreon page now. In that video, I used some chord progressions that my patrons sent me, and I demonstrate how I might voice those progressions in different contexts. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.